and welcome to ASMR Storytime. I want to take a moment and thank all of you who are watching. I started this channel because I love ASMR. I have been watching ASMR videos for years before it was such a big thing, and I absolutely love it. I've seen, so many different methods, so many different triggers. One of the things that I really love about ASMR is how relaxing it is. But the biggest problem that I had was people love to use so many different things in their videos that I get so excited about what's coming next that I have a hard time falling asleep watching it. So I have to either I watch it on my phone before I go to bed, and I have to either turn my phone upside down so I can't see it, or I have to turn my brightness on my screen all the way down. So I wanted to try something that was a little bit different, something that's meant to be almost on the boring side, something that would really sort of help you lull you into a sleep. That's my goal with this channel, and I understand that some people are not going to be interested in that, and that's okay. But I have noticed that I do have a few supporters, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank them. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I have a little note for one of my supporters. I just wanted to say thank you for your support, Blue Book. We love you here at ASMR Storytime. We hope that you'll continue to watch us, join us, like us, and subscribe. And I just want to thank you again for your comment. It was so sweet to get that. I hope you'll enjoy today. I do also hope that let me just go ahead and apologize a little. The weather's changing where I live, so I'm having some voice issues. I may have to take a couple of breaks today, just so that I can get something down my, some kind of drink. Or you may hear me clear my throat quite a bit, and I'm sorry about that. My plans for this evening are to go ahead and try to finish part 2 of the Red Tent, which would be the last 2 chapters, 7 and 8. We may get into part 3 with chapter 1. We'll see how we go on time. But I'm going to stop talking now and go ahead and finish unboxing, and then we'll get into the story. Chapter 7. Sometimes we were called to assist a laboring mother who lived within sight of the city. Those trips were my special delight. The walls of Shechem awed me more than the misty mountains that inspired sacrifices from Jacob and Zilpah. The minds that had conceived such a great project made me feel wise, and the force of the sinews that had built the fortress made me feel strong. Whenever I caught sight of the walls, I could not look away. I longed to go inside, to see the temple square and the narrow streets and crowded houses. I knew a little about the shape of the place from Joseph, who had been to Shechem with her brothers. Joseph said that the palace where Hamor the king lived in splendor with his Egyptian wife and 15 concubines contained more rooms than I had brothers. Joseph said that Hamor had more servants than we had sheep. Not that a dusty shepherd like my brother could even hope for a peek inside such a grand place. Still, I liked his tall stories. Even lies about the place thrilled me, and I fancied that I could smell the perfume of the courtesans on my brother's tunic when he returned from the market. My mother decided she wanted to see the place for herself. Leah was certain that she could drive a better bargain for our wool than Reuben, who was too generous to be trusted with such transactions. I nearly kissed her hands when she said I would go to help her. Reuben settled us into a good spot just outside the gate, but he stood at a distance from us when our mother began calling out to every passing stranger and haggled like a camel trader with those who approached. There was little for me to do but watch, which I did happily. That day at the eastern gate was a marvel. I saw my first jugglers. I ate my first pomegranate. I saw black faces and brown faces, goats with impossibly curly coats, women covered in black robes, and slave girls who wore nothing at all. It was like being on the highway again, but without sore feet. I saw a dwarf hobbling alongside a donkey, as white as the moon, and watched the captain's high priest buy olives. Then I saw Tabia, or at least I thought I saw her. A girl of her height and coloring walked toward our display. She was dressed in the white robes of the temple, head shaven, both ears pierced. I stood and called out to her, but she turned on her heels and rushed away. Without thinking, and before my mother could stop me, I ran after her, as though I were a child and not a young woman. "Tabia," I called out, "cousin," but she did not hear me, or if she did not stop, and the white robes disappeared through a doorway. Reuben caught up with me. "What were you doing?" he asked. "I thought it was Tabia," I said near tears, but I was mistaken. "Tabia?" he asked. "A cousin from Eshua? You do not know her," I said. "I'm sorry I made you chase me. Is mother angry?" He laughed at the foolishness of my question, and I laughed too. She was furious, and I had to sit facing the wall the rest of the afternoon. But by then my light heart had gone out of me, and I was content just listening to the sounds of the marketplace, nursing the memories of my lost friend. After our return from that trip, a messenger arrived from the city. She wore a linen robe and beautiful sandals, and would speak only to Rachel. "One of the women in the king's household is about to deliver," she said to my aunt. "Hamor's queen calls for the midwives from Jacob's house to attend." Leah was not pleased when I began to prepare my kit for the journey. She went to Rachel and asked, "Why not take Ina to the queen with you? Why do you insist on taking Dina away from me just when there are olives to harvest?" My aunt shrugged. "You know that Ina cannot walk as far as the city any longer. If you wish me to take a slave, I will. But the queen expects 2 of us, and she will not be so disposed to buy your woolens if I walk into the palace without a skilled assistant." Leah glared at her sister's smooth words, and I dropped my eyes to the ground so that my mother could not see how much I longed to go. I held my breath as my mother decided. "Pah," she said, throwing up her hands and walking away. I clapped my hands over my mouth to keep from crowing, and Rachel grinned at me like a child who had outfoxed her elders. We finished our preparations and dressed in festival robes, but Rachel stopped me before we walked out and braided my hair into smooth ropes. "Egyptian style," she whispered. Bila and Zilpah waved us off, but Leah was nowhere to be seen as we headed into the valley with the messenger. Walking through the gates of the city that first time, I was sorely disappointed. The streets were smaller and dustier than I had imagined. The smell was an awful mixture of rotten fruit and human waste. We moved too quickly to see inside the dark hovels, but I could hear and smell the goats lived with their owners, and I finally understood my father's disdain for city dwelling. Once we crossed the threshold of the palace, we entered a different world. The walls were thick enough to block out the sounds and smells of the street, and the courtyard in which we stood is spacious and bright. A naked slave approached and motioned for us to follow her through one of the doorways into the women's quarters, and then into the room where the mother-to-be panted on the floor. She was about my age, and by the look of her, early in her labor. Rachel touched her belly and examined the wound and rolled her eyes at me. We had been summoned for the most straightforward of births. Not that either of us minded. A trip to the palace was an adventure for which we were grateful. Soon after we met the mother, Hamor's queen walked into the room, curious to see the hill-bred midwives. The queen, who was called Renefer, wore a gossamer linen sheath covered by a tunic of turquoise beads, the most elegant clothing I had ever seen. Even so, my aunt was not outshone by the lady. Old as Rachel was, lined by sun and work, crouched on the floor with her hand between the legs of a woman in travail. Even so, my aunt glowed, her golden light. Her hair was still lustrous, and her black eyes sparkled. The women looked at each other with approval and nodded their greeting. Renefer raised her gown above her knees and squatted on the other side of Ashnan, for that was the name of the young mother who huffed and moaned more in fear than pain. The 2 older women began to talk about oils that might ease the baby's head, and I was impressed both at how much the noble woman knew of birthing and at Rachel's ease of conversing with a queen. Ashnan, it turned out, was the daughter of the queen's nursemaid. The woman on the bricks had been a playmate of her own son's infancy and his milk sister, just like Joseph and me. The nursemaid had died when the children were still babies, and Renefer had been tender toward the girl ever since, and was even more so now that she was pregnant by Hamor. Ashnan was his newest concubine. All this was learned from Renefer, who stayed beside Ashnan from noon until nearly sunset. The mother was strong and all the signs were good, but the birth went slowly. Strong pains were followed by low pauses, and when Ashnan fell asleep late in the afternoon, exhausted by her labors, Renefer took Rachel to her own chamber for refreshment, and I was left to watch the mother. I was nearly asleep myself when I heard a man's voice in the antechamber. I should have sent word through the slave girl, but I didn't think of it. I was bored and stiff from sitting so many hours, so I rose and went myself. His name was Shalom. He was a firstborn son, the handsomest and quickest of the king's children, well liked by the people of Shechem. He was golden and beautiful as a sunset. I dropped my eyes to the ground to keep from staring, as though he were a two-headed goat or something else that defied the order of things. And yet, he did defy nature. He was perfect. To avoid looking up into his face, I noticed that his fingernails were clean and that his hands were smooth. His arms were not black from the sun like my brother's, though neither were they sickly. He wore only a skirt, and his chest was naked, hairless, well-muscled. He was looking at me too, and I shuddered at the stains on my apron. Even my festival tunic seemed shabby and drab compared to the gleaming homespun of the simple garment he wore at home. My hair was awry and uncovered. My feet were dirty. I began to hear the sound of breathing without knowing if it was my own or his. Finally, I could not help myself, and I lifted my eyes to his. He stood taller than me by a handbreadth. His hair was black and shining, his teeth straight and white. His eyes were golden or green or brown. In truth, I did not look there long enough to discern their color, because I had never been greeted with such a look. His mouth smiled politely, but his eyes sought the answer to a question I did not fully understand. My ears rang. I wanted to run, and yet I did not wish to end this strange agony of confusion and need that came upon me. I said nothing. He was disconcerted too. He coughed into his fist, glanced toward the doorway where Ashnan lay, and stared at me. Finally, he stuttered a question about his milk sister. I must have said something, though I have no memory of my words. All I remember is the ache in the moment when we met in that bare little hallway. It amazes me to think of all that happened in the space of a silent breath or two. All the while I scolded myself, thinking foolish, childish, foolish. My mother will laugh when I tell her. But I knew I would not be telling this to my mother, and that thought made me blush. Not the warmth of my feeling for this Shalom, whose name I had not even learned, whose presence made me dumb and weak. What caused my cheeks to color was the understanding that I would not speak of the fullness and the fire in my heart to Leah. He saw me color, and his smile widened. My awkwardness vanished, and I smiled back, and it was as though the bride price had been paid and the dowry agreed to. It was as though we were alone in our bridal tent. The question had been answered. It sounds comical to me now, and if a child of mine confessed such things to me, I would laugh out loud or scold her. But on that day, I was a girl who was ready for a man. As we grinned at each other, I remembered the sounds from Judah's tent, and I understood my own fevered nights. Shalom, who was a few years older than I, recognized his own longing, and yet felt more than the simple stirring of desire, or that is what he said after we had redeemed our promise and lay in each other's arms. He said he was smitten and shy in the antechamber of the women's quarters. He said he had been enchanted, struck dumb and thrilled like me. I did not think we spoke another word before Rachel and the queen swept into the room and pulled me back into the birth chamber. I did not have time to think of Shalem then, for Ashnon's water broke and she delivered a big, healthy boy who barely ripped her flesh. You will heal in a week, Rachel told the girl, who sobbed with relief that it was done. We slept in the palace that night, though I hardly closed my eyes with excitement. Leaving the next morning was like dying. I thought I might never see him again. I thought perhaps it had been a mistake on my part, the fantasy of a raw country girl in the presence of a prince. But my heart rebelled at the idea, and I twisted my neck looking back as we departed, thinking he might come to claim me. But Shalem did not appear, and I bit my lips to keep from weeping as we climbed the hills back to my father's tents. Nobody knew. I thought they would all see it in me. I thought that Rachel would guess at my secret and pry the story from me as we walked home. But my aunt wanted only to talk about Renefer, who had praised her skills and given her a necklace of onyx beads. When we returned to camp, my mother hugged me without sensing the new heat in my body and sent me to the olive grove where the harvest was busy. Silpa was there overseeing the press and barely answered my greeting. Even Bila of the discerning heart was preoccupied with a batch of oil jars that had cracked, and she saw nothing. Their inattention was a revelation to me. Before my trip to Shechem, I had supposed that my mothers could see my thoughts and look directly into my heart. But now I discovered that I was separate, opaque and drawn into an orbit of which they had no knowledge. I delighted in the discovery of my solitude and protected it, keeping myself busy at the far end of the orchard and even sleeping in the makeshift tent near the edge of the harvest with my brother's wives. I was happy to be alone, thinking only of my beloved, numbering his qualities, imagining his virtues. I stared at my hands and wondered what it would be like to touch his gleaming shoulders, his beautiful arms. In my dreams, I saw sunlight sparkling on water, and I awoke smiling. After 3 days of drunken happiness, my hopes began to sour. Would he come for me? Were these calloused hands too rough to delight a prince? I chewed on my fingernails and forgot to eat. At night, I lay sleepless on my blanket, turning our meeting over and over in my head. I could think of nothing but him, yet I began to doubt my memories. Perhaps his smile had been one of indulgence rather than of recognition. Perhaps I was a fool. But just as I began to fear that I would betray myself to my mothers in a flood of tears, I was saved. The king himself sent for me. Hamor would deny his young consort nothing, and when Ashnan asked if Jacob's kind young daughter could be brought to distract her during her confinement, a messenger was dispatched. The king's man even brought a slave to take my place in the harvest. My mother found the gesture thoughtful and generous. "Let her go," she said to my father. Jacob did not object and sent Levi to accompany me to the door of the women's quarters in Hamar's palace. Waving to my mothers, I could see Bela and Rachel peering after me. Either my haste or my pleasure at the king's bidding alerted them to something, but by then it was too late to ask. They waved back as I descended into the valley, but I could feel their questions at my back. A hawk circled high above us all the way down into the valley. Levi said it was a good sign, but the messenger spit on the ground every time the bird's shadow crossed our path. My brother left me at the door of Hamar's palace, charging me in a loud, pompous voice for the benefit of the messenger to behave as befits one of the daughters of Jacob. Since I was Jacob's only surviving daughter, I smiled. I had been told to behave as myself, and I had every intention of doing that. In the next 3 weeks, I met the daughters of Shechem, the wives of all the important men who came to visit Ashnot and her little boy, who would not be publicly named until he reached 3 months, according to the custom of Egypt. "So the demons will not know how to find him," Ashnot whispered, fearing the presence of evil even within the safety of her comfortable rooms. Ashnot was rather a silly girl with fine teeth and big breasts, which regained their shape and beauty quickly after the baby was given to a nurse. I had never heard of a healthy woman giving an infant to another woman's breast. In my world, a wet nurse was used only when the mother was dead or dying. But then, what did I know of the lives of royal women? Indeed, I was amazed by almost everything I saw at first. I did not much care for being Ashnon's servant, for that is how she treated me. I brought her food and fed it to her. I bathed her feet and her face. She wanted a massage, and so I learned the art from an old woman of the house. She wanted paints as well, and chattered away as she taught me how to apply kohl around my own eyes and a ground green powder on my lids. "Not only does it make you look beautiful," said Ashnot, "it keeps the gnats away." Ashnot also taught me boredom, which is a dreadful calamity visited upon women in palaces. There was one afternoon I actually shed tears at the monotony of having to sit still as Ashnot slept. All I had to occupy myself was worry over whether Shalom was aware of my presence under his father's roof. I began to doubt that he remembered the unkempt assistant to his milk sister's midwife. I was trapped without answers, for the walls between the women's world and the men's quarters were thick, and in the world of the palace there was no work to create a crossing of paths. After many days, Renefer looked in upon Ashnot, and I tried to find the courage to speak to her about her son, but all I could do was stammer in her presence and blush. "Do you miss your mother, child?" she kindly asked. I shook my head, but looked so miserable that the queen took my hand and said, "You need some distraction, I think. A girl like you who lives under the sun must feel like a trapped bird within these walls." I smiled at Renefer as she squeezed my fingers. "You will go out into the marketplace with my maid," she said. "Help her pick the best of the pomegranates and see if you can hunt up some fine figs for my son. Shalom likes figs. The next morning I walked out of the palace and into the babble of the city, where I stared to my heart's content. The servant by my side seemed in no hurry and let me wander where I would. I stopped at almost every stall and blanket, wonderstruck at the variety and quantity of lamps, fruits, woven goods, cheeses, dyes, tools, livestock, baskets, jewelry, flutes, herbs, everything. But there were no figs to be had that day. We searched for them until I was nearly dizzy from the heat and thirst, but I hated to return to the palace without satisfying the queen's request, without bringing fruit to my beloved. Finally, when we had looked in every corner, there was nothing to do but turn back. At the moment we set our path for the palace, I spied the oldest face I had ever seen, an herb sailor, whose black skin was lined deep as a dry wadi. I stood by her blanket and listened to her rattle on about some liniment, good for the backache. But when I leaned down to finger a root I had never seen, she grabbed my wrist and stared up into my face. Ah, the young lady wants something for her lover, something magic that will bring her young man to bed, so she may rid of her tiresome virginity. I pulled my arm away, horrified that the conjurer had seen so far into my heart. It was probably only a speech she made to every young girl who approached, but Renefer's maid saw my confusion and laughed. I was mortified and rushed away from the old one. I did not see Shalom approach, but he stood before me, the afternoon sunlight filling the sky around his head like a glowing crown. I looked into his face and gasped. "Are you well, my lady?" he asked, in the sweet, reedy voice that I remembered. I was mute. He looked at me with the same hunger I felt, and put a warm hand on my elbow to squire me back to the palace, the queen's woman following us, wearing a big grin. Her mistress had been right. There was a light between the prince and the granddaughter of Mamre. Unlike me, Renefer's son had not been able to hide his heart from his mother. Renefer had despised the women of the city since she arrived in Shechem as a young bride. Stupid and empty, she branded them all. They spin badly, weave atrociously, dress like men, and know nothing of herbs. They will bear you stupid children, Renefer had told her son. We will do better for you. Renefer had been impressed by the bearing of the midwife from the hills, and she had liked the looks of the girl carrying her bag too. She approved of my height and the strength of my arms, my coloring, and the way I carried my head. The fact that one as young as I was already walking in a midwife's path told her I was no fool. When Rachel had gone with the queen for refreshments during Ashnon's labor, Renefer had gotten more information about me so discreetly that Rachel did not suspect her purpose as she was quizzed about my age, my mother's status, my skill at hearth and loom. When Renefer and Rachel surprised me and Shalom in the anteroom, she discerned at once that the seed of her idea had already sprouted on its own. She did what she could to nurture its growth. Renefer told Ashnon to send for me from my father's house, and she told her son to go out to seek me in the market that morning. "I'm afraid that little girl from the hills will be lost," she said to Shalom. "You know that my servant is fool enough to let her out of her sight. But maybe you do not remember the looks of the one called Dina, she asked her son. She was the dark-eyed girl with the curly hair and the fine hands who came with the midwife. You spoke to her in the antechamber when Ashnon was in travail. Shalom agreed to do his mother's bidding with such speed that Raineffer had trouble stifling a laugh. When the prince and I returned to the palace, we found the courtyard deserted, as Raineffer had instructed. The servants disappeared. We stood in silence for only a moment when Shalom drew me into his shadow of a corner and put his hands on my shoulders and covered my mouth with his mouth and pressed his body against mine. And I, who had never been touched or kissed by any man, was unafraid. He did not hurry or push, and I put my hands on his back and pressed into his chest and melted into his hands and his mouth. When his lips found my throat, I groaned, and Shalom stopped. He looked into my face to discover my meaning, and seeing only yes, he took my hand and led me down an unfamiliar corridor into a room with a polished floor and a bed that stood on legs carved like the claws of a hawk. We lay down upon sweet-smelling black fleas and found one another. I did not cry out when he took me, because though he was young, my lover did not rush. Afterward, when Shalom lay still at last and discovered my cheeks were wet, he said, "Oh, little wife, do not let me hurt you again." But I told him that my tears had nothing of pain in them. They were the first tears of happiness in my life. "Taste them," I said to my beloved, and he found that they were sweet. And he wept as well. We clung to each other like Shalom's desire was renewed, and did not hold my breath when he entered me, so I began to feel what was happening to my body and to understand the pleasures of love. No one disturbed us. Night fell and food was left at the doorway, wonderful fruits and golden wine, fresh bread and olives and cakes dripping in honey. We ate every morsel like famished dogs. After we ate, he washed me in a large tub of warm water that appeared as mysteriously as the food. He told me of Egypt and of the great river where he would take me to bask and swim. "I cannot swim," I told Shalom. "Good," he replied. "Then I can be the one to teach you." He put his hands into my hair until they were tangled in knots, and it took us a long moment to free him. "I love these shekels," he said, when he could not free himself, and he grew large, and our coupling was exquisitely slow. His hands caressed my face, and we cried out in pleasure together. Whenever we were not kissing or coupling or sleeping, Shalom and I traded stories. I told him of my father and my mother's, and described my brothers one by one. He was delighted by their names and learned each one in the order of his birth, and knew which one came from the womb of which mother. I'm not sure my own father could have listed them so well. He told me of his tutor, a cripple with a wonderful voice who taught him to sing and to read. Shalom told me of his mother's devotion and his 5 half-brothers, none of whom had learned the arts of Egypt. He told me of his trip to the priestess who initiated him in the art of love in the name of heaven. "I never saw her face," he said. The rites take place in the innermost chamber, where there is no light. It was like a dream locked inside a dream. He told me of 3 times he had slept with a slave girl who giggled in his embrace and asked for payment afterward. But by the end of our second day together, our embraces outnumbered our experiences with other women. I have forgotten them all, he said. Then I will forgive you them all, I said. We made love again and again. We slept and awoke with our hands in each other. We kissed each other everywhere, and I learned the flavor of my lover's toes, the smell of his sex before and after coupling, the dampness of his neck. We were together as bride and groom for 3 days before I began to wonder why I had not been fetched to go and wash Ashnon's feet or rub her back. Shalem, too, forgot his obligatory evening meals with his father. But Rhaenyra took care that we should know nothing of the world and that the world should give us peace. She sent choice foods at all hours of the day and night and instructed the servants to fill Shalem's bath with fresh scented water whenever we slept. I had no worries for the future. Shalem said our lovemaking sealed our marriage. He teased me about the bride price he would bring to my father, buckets of gold coins, camels laden with lapis and linen, a caravan of slaves, a herd of sheep so fine their wool would never need washing. You deserve a queen's ransom, he whispered, as we drifted back into our shared dreams. I will build you a tomb of surpassing beauty, Shalem said. The world will never forget the name Dina, who judged my heart worthy. I wish I had been as bold with my words. Not that I was shy. Shalem knew of my delight in him, my gratitude for him, my lust for him. I gave everything. I abandoned myself to him and in him. It was only that I could not find a voice for the flood of my happiness. While I lay in Shalem's first embrace, Levi was storming out of Harem's palace, furious that he had not been given the audience with the king that he considered his due. My brother had been dispatched to see when I would be sent home, and had been given a fine meal and a bed for the night. My life might have had a different telling. Later, I wondered what might have happened had Reuben or Judah come for me. Hamor was not eager to meet with this particular son of Jacob, the quarrelsome who had accused him of swindling the family. Why should the king suffer through another round of accusations by some whining son of a shepherd? If it had been Reuben, Hamor would have welcomed him to dine and spend the night. Indeed, if it had been any of the others, even Joseph, he would have received a fine welcome. Hamor approved of Jacob nearly as much as the queen liked Jacob's wives. The king knew that my father tended his flocks with such skill that he had quickly become the richest shepherd in the valley. Jacob's wool was the softest, his wife skilled, and his sons loyal. He caused no feuds among neighbors. He had enriched the valley, and Hamor was eager for good relations with him. Marriages between their two houses were much to be desired, so Hamor was pleased when Rhaenyra whispered that his son favored Jacob's daughter. Indeed, as soon as the king heard that Shalem was lying with me, he began to count out a handsome bride price. When Hamor heard from the servants that the young couple were well matched, adoring, and busy producing his grandson, the news aroused him so much that he called Ashnon to his bed a full week before her confinement was due to end. When Rhaenyra discovered them, she barely scolded her husband and the girl, so great was her joy at her son's match. On the 4th day of our happiness, Shalem arose from our bath, dressed, and told me he was going to speak to his father. It is time for Hamor to arrange for the bride price. He looked so handsome in his tunic and sandals that my eyes filled with tears again. No more weeping, not even for happiness, he said, and lifted me still wet from the water and kissed my nose and mouth and put me on the bed and said, "Wait for me, my beloved. Do not dress. Only lie here so I may think of you like this. I won't be long." I covered his face with kisses and told him to hurry back. I was asleep when he slipped beside me, smelling of the world beyond our bed for the first time in days. Hamor departed for Jacob's camp early the next morning, a laden wagon behind him. He did not bring a tent or servants for a night's stay. He did not expect to stay or to haggle. How could he have imagined any objection to his good news and generous gift? The news about Shalem and Jacob's daughter was widespread in the city, but unknown by Jacob's tents. When he heard that I had been taken as wife by the prince of the city, he said nothing and made no reply to Hamor's offer. He stood like a stone, staring at the man of whom his sons, Levi and Simon, had spoken with such venom. A man of his own years, it turned out, but richly dressed, smooth-spoken and fat. The king waved at the cart laden with goods and trailing sheep and goats. He declared them kin, soon to share a grandchild. Jacob hooded his eyes and covered his mouth with his hands so Hamor could not see his discomfort or surprise. He nodded as Hamor praised his daughter's beauty. Jacob had given no thought to a marriage for his daughter, although his wife had begun to speak of it. She was of age, to be sure, but Jacob was uneasy about this match, although he could not say why, and he felt his neck stiffen as Hamor's expectation that he would do as he was told. He searched his mind for a way to postpone a decision, a way to regain the upper hand. "I will discuss this with my sons," he told the king, with more force than he meant. Hamor was stung. "Your daughter is no virgin, Jacob," the king pressed. "Yet here is a bride price fit for a virgin princess of Egypt, more than my own father gave for my wife. Not that your daughter is unworthy of this and more. Name what you wish and it's yours, for my son loves the girl, and I hear she is willing to." And here Hamor smiled a bit too broadly for Jacob's taste. He did not like to hear his daughter spoken of so crudely, even though he could not quite conjure up the image of Dinah's face. All he could recall clearly was the sight of her hair, unruly and wild as she chased after Joseph. The memory came from long ago. "I will wait for my sons," said Jacob, as he turned away from the king as though the lord of Shechem were no more than a shepherd, and left it to his wives to welcome the king with drink and food. But Hamor saw no reason to stay and headed back to the palace, trailing his gifts behind him. Jacob called for Leah and spoke to her in the hardest words he had ever used with a wife. "Your daughter is no longer a girl," he said. "You are insolent to keep this from me. You have overreached before, but never to shame me, and now this." My mother was as surprised as her husband and pressed Jacob for news of her daughter. "The prince of Shechem has claimed her. His father came to pay the full bride price of a virgin, and so I assumed that she was until she went within the walls of that dung heap of a city." Jacob was bitter. "She is of Shechem now, I suppose, and of no use to me." Leah was furious. "Go seek out your wife, my sister," she said. "It was Rachel who took her there. Rachel is the one with eyes for the city, not me. Husband, ask your wife." and the smell of bile rose from my mother's words. I wonder if she thought of me at all then, if she suffered over whether I was consented or cried out, if her heart reached out to discover whether I wept or rejoiced. But her words spoke only of the loss of her daughter gone to the city where she would reside with foreign women, learn their ways, and forget her mother. My father called for Rachel next. "Husband," cried Rachel, smiling as she approached him, "I hear there are happy tidings." But Jacob did not smile. "I do not like the city or its king," he said, "but I like even less an untrustworthy daughter and a lying wife." "Say nothing you will regret," replied Rachel. "My sister sets you against me and against our only daughter, who is beloved, and your mother of Mamre. This is a good match. The king says they are fond, does he not? Have you forgotten your own fire, husband? Have you grown so old that you do not remember that longing?" Jacob's face betrayed nothing. He looked long at Rachel, and she returned his gaze. "Give them your blessing, husband," Rachel said. "Take the wagons laden with silver and linen, and give Hamor the welcome due a king. You are the master here. There is no need to wait." But Jacob stiffened at Rachel's insistence. "When my sons return from their travels, I will decide." Hamor could not recall ever being treated so badly. Even so, he was well disposed towards Jacob. "A good ally, I think," he told Shalem the next day, "but an enemy to avoid. He is a proud man." Hamor said, "He does not like to lose control of his family's fate. Odd that he should not yet know how children stop serving their parents once they are grown, even daughters." But Shalem pressed his father to return as soon as possible. "I love the girl," he said. Hamor grinned. "Fear not, the girl is yours. No father would want her back as she is now. Go back to your wife and let me worry about the father." Another week passed, and my husband and I grew to love each other in subtler ways, with caresses and endearments. My feet did not touch ground. My face ached from smiling, and then I received a special wedding gift. Bela came to see me. My aunt appeared at the palace gate asking for Dinah, wife of Shalem. She was taken first to Renefer, who plied her with questions about Jacob's hesitancy over her husband's offer. The queen asked about Leah and Rachel as well, and told Bela not to leave the palace without gifts for her daughter-in-law's family. And then Renefer herself brought my aunt to me. My hug lifted my little aunt off the ground, and I covered her dark face with a dozen kisses. "You are glowing," she said, when she stood back, holding my hands in hers. "You are happy," she smiled. "It is wonderful that you should find such happiness. I will tell Leah, and she will be reconciled." "Is my mother angry?" I asked, bewildered. "Leah believes Rachel sold you into the hands of evil. She is like your father in her distrust of the city, and she is not pleased that you will make your bed within walls. Mostly, I think she misses you, but I will tell her of the light in your eyes, of the smile on your lips, and of your womanly bearing now that you are a wife." "He is good to you, yes?" Bela asked, giving me the chance to praise my Shalem. I found myself bursting to tell someone the details of my happiness, and I spilled everything to Bela, willing ear. She clapped her hands to hear me speak like a bride. "Oh, to love and be loved like this," she sighed. Bela ate with me and peeked at Shalem. She agreed that he was beautiful, but refused to meet him. "I cannot speak to him before my husband does," she demurred. "But I have seen enough to bring back a good report of our daughter." In the morning she embraced me and left with Reuben, who had brought her. She carried the word of my happiness into my father's tents, but her voice was drowned out by the shouts of my brothers, who called me a harlot, and Jacob did nothing to stop their foul mouths. Simon and Levi had returned to our father after several days, defeated in a secret purpose. They had been in Ashkelon, seeking trade not merely for the family's goats and sheep, wool and oil, but to speak with slave traders whose business could yield far greater wealth than any hard-earned harvest of the earth. Simon and Levi wanted wealth and the power it would bring them, but they had no hope of inheriting those from Jacob. It was clear that Reuben could get their father's birthrights, and the blessings would go to Joseph, so they were determined to carve out their own glory however they could. But Levi and Simon discovered that the slavers wanted nothing but children. Business was bad, too many traders had weakened the market, and now they were assured of a good price only for healthy youngsters. My brothers could get nothing at all in trade for the 2 old serving women they had from their wives' dowries. They returned home thwarted and bitter. When they heard that Hamor had offered my father a king's bride price for me, they raised their voices against the marriage, sensing that their own positions would be diminished by such an alliance. Jacob's house would be swallowed up in the dynasties of Shechem, and while Reuben might expect to become a prince, they and their sons would remain shepherds, poor cousins, nobodies. We will be lower than Eshua, they muttered to each other and to the brothers over whom they still held sway. Zebulun, Issachar, and Naphtali, of Leah's womb, and Zilpah's Gad and Asher. When Jacob called all his sons to his tent to consider Hamor's offer, Simon raised his fist and cried, "Revenge! My sister has been ravaged by an Egyptian dog." Reuben spoke on behalf of Shalem. "Our sister did not cry out," he said, "nor does the prince cast her aside." Judah agreed. "The size of the bride price is a compliment to our sister, to our father, and to all the house of Jacob. We will become princes ourselves. We would be fools not to take the gifts that the gods give us. What kind of idiot mistakes a blessing for a curse?" But Levi ripped his clothing as though mourning my death, and Simon warned, "This is a trap for the sons of Jacob. If we permit this marriage, the fleshpots of the city will consume my sons and my brother's sons. This marriage displeases the gods of our father," he said, challenging Jacob to disagree. Their voices grew loud, and my brothers glared at one another across the lamps, but Jacob did not let his own thoughts be known. "The uncircumcised dog rapes my sister every day," Simon thundered. "Am I to permit this desecration of our only sister, my only mother's daughter?" At this, Joseph pulled a skeptical face and half whispered to Reuben, "If my brother is so concerned about the shape of our brother-in-law's penis, let our father demand his foreskin for a bride price. Indeed, let all the men of Shechem become like us. Let them pile up their membranes as high as my father's tent pole, so that their sons and ours will piss the same and rut the same, and none will be able to tell us apart. And thus the tribe of Jacob grow not merely in generations to come, but even tomorrow." Jacob seized upon Joseph's words, which had been spoken only in mockery of the brothers who had tortured him since infancy. But Jacob did not hear the edge of his son's words. He said, "Abram took up the knife for those of his household who were not of his covenant. If the men of Shechem agreed to this, none could say that our daughter was injured. If the men of the city make such sacrifice to the God of my fathers, we shall be remembered as makers of souls, as gatherers of men, like the stars in the heavens, as it was told to our father Abram. Like the sands of the sea was it foretold by my mother Rebekah, and now I will make it come to pass. I will do what Joseph says, for he has my heart. Jacob spoke with such passion that there was no use in further speech. Levi's face twisted in anger at Jacob's decision, but Simon placed a hand on his brother's arm and pulled him away into the night, far from the light of the lamps and the ears of the brothers. When Hamor journeyed to Jacob's tent the second time, Shalom accompanied him, determined not to return to the city without my father's blessing. He brought 2 donkeys laden with still more gifts. My beloved was confident as he left, but when he reached my father's tent, the king's party was again met with crossed arms, and not so much as a ladle of water was offered before the men began discussing terms. My father spoke first, and without ceremony. You come for our daughter, he said. We will agree to the marriage, but I doubt if our terms will suit you, for they are severe. Hamor replied, his earlier warmth from the man blasted by the insulting lack of hospitality. My son loves the girl, the king said. He will do anything for her, and I will do what my son wishes. Name your terms, Jacob. Shechem will fulfill them so that my children and my children will bring forth new generations upon the land. But when Jacob named the price for his daughter, Hamor paled. What form of barbarity is this? He asked. Who do you think you are, shepherd, to demand the blood of my son's manhood and mine and that of my kinsmen and subjects? You are mad from too much sun, too many years in the wilderness. Do you want the girl back such as she is? You must think very little of your daughter to make such a sport of this future. But Shalom stepped forward and put his hand on his father's arm. I agreed to the demands, he said to Jacob's face. Here and now, if you like, I will honor the custom of my wife's family, and I will order my slaves and their sons to follow me. I know my father speaks out of fear for me and in loyalty to his men who would suffer. But for me, there is no question. I hear and I obey. Hamor would have argued against his son's offer, and Levi and Simon were poised to spit in their faces. The air smelled like lightning, and daggers might have been drawn had Bela not appeared with water and wine. Women with bread and oil followed, and Jacob nodded for them to serve. They ate a few mouthfuls in silence. The terms were agreed to that evening. Jacob accepted 4 laden donkeys for a bride price. Shalom and Hamor would go under the knife in 3 days, as would the men of Shechem, noble and slave alike. All of the healthy men found within the walls of the city on the same morning would also accept the mark of Jacob upon them, and Hamor promised that every son born within the city from that time forth would be circumcised on the 8th day, as was the custom among the sons of Abram. Hamor also pledged that the God of Jacob would be worshipped in his temple, and the king went so far as to call him Elohim, and one God, the one God of many gods. My father made me a handsome dowry, 18 sheep and 18 goats, all of my clothing and jewelry, my spindle and grindstone, 10 jars of new oil, and 6 great bolts of wool. Jacob agreed to permit marriages between his children and those of Shechem from that time forth. Hamor put his hand under Jacob's thigh, and Jacob touched the king as well, and my betrothal was sealed without a smile or satisfaction. That same night, Shalom slipped away from his father's tent and back into our bed with news. "You are a married woman now, and not merely a ruined girl," he whispered, waking me before the first light of the morning. I kissed him and pushed him away. "Well then, now that I am wed, and you may not put me aside, I may tell you that my head aches, and I cannot receive my lord at this moment," I said, gathering my robe around my shoulders and feigning a great yawn even as I slipped my hand between my husband's legs. "You know, my lord, that women only submit to the caresses of their husbands. They do not enjoy the rough use of their bodies." Shalom laughed and pulled me down on the bed, and we made love with great tenderness that morning. It was a reunion after what had been our longest parting. Since that day he found me in the market and led me to his bed, which we had made ours. We slept late into the day, and only after we had eaten did he tell me my father's demand. I grew cold and my stomach turned. In my mind's eye, I saw my beloved in agonies of pain, saw the knife cut too deep, the wound fester, and Shalom dying in my arms. I burst into tears like a little child. Shalom made light of it. "It is nothing," he said, "a flesh wound, and I hear that afterward my pleasure of you will be even greater than it is now. So prepare yourself, woman. I will be upon you night and day." But I did not smile. I shivered with the cold that entered my bones, and I would not leave. Raineffer tried to reassure me too. She was not displeased at the bargain her husband had struck. "In Egypt," she said, "they take boys for circumcision when their voices change. It is a merry enough time. They chase the boys and catch them, and afterward they are petted and fed on every sweet and savory thing they ask for. Rest assured they all survive." "We will have my guard do the deed," she said. "Nahesai has dispatched many a foreskin. I can care for the pain, and you will help my little midwife." She rattled on and on about how easy it would be, and then whispered with knowing leer, "Do you not find the male member more attractive without its hood?" But I found nothing amusing about Shalom's test, and I did not return my mother-in-law's smile. The 3 days passed. I clung to my husband like a wild thing those nights. The tears ran down my face even as I reached greater pleasure than before. My husband licked the water from my cheeks and ran his salty tongue the length of my body. "I will teach you about this when our first son is born," he whispered, as I lay on his chest, still shaking with cold. The appointed hour arrived. Shalom left me at dawn. I stayed in bed, pretending to sleep, watching him wash and dress through closed eyes. He leaned down to kiss me, but I did not turn my face up to meet his lips. I lay there alone, counting my hatred. I hated my father for asking such a terrible price. I hated my husband and his father for agreeing to pay it. I hated my mother-in-law for smoothing the way. I hated myself most for being the cause of it all. I lay in bed, huddled beneath blankets, shivering with anger and fear and unrecognized foreboding, until he was brought back to me. It was done in the king's antechamber. Shalom was first, and then his father, Hamor. Nahisi said that neither king nor prince cried out. Ashnon's little son followed and wailed, but the little one did not suffer long, since he had a full breast to console him. The men of the household and the few poor souls who had not disappeared to the countryside outside the walls were not so lucky. They felt the knife keenly, and many screamed as though they were murdered. Their cries pierced the air throughout the morning, but ceased by noon. It turned into an unmercifully hot day. There was no breeze or cloud, or even within the thick walls of the palace the air was damp and heavy. The recovering men sweated through their clothing and soaked the beds where they slept. Hamor, who uttered no sound when he was cut, fainted in pain, and when he woke, put a knife between his teeth to keep from screaming. Meshalem suffered too, though not as badly. He was younger, and the salve seemed to ease him, but for him too the only complete remedy was sleep. I dosed him with sleeping draught, and whenever he roused, he was thick-headed and weary, slack-jawed and dazed. I bathed my beloved's face as he slept his drugged sleep, and washed his sweating back with the softest touch I could muster. I did my best not to weep so my face would be fresh when he awoke, but as the day wore on, the tears came in spite of my efforts. By nightfall I was exhausted, and I slept by my husband's side, swathed in blankets against the icy winds of my fears, even as Shalem slept naked in the heat. In the night I woke once to feel Shalem caressing my cheek. When he saw my eyes open, he managed a wincing smile and said, "Soon this will be nothing but a dream, and our embraces will be sweeter than ever." His eyes closed again, and I heard him snore for the first time. As I drifted into sleep, I thought how I would tease him about the noise he made in his sleep, like an old dog in the sun. To this day, I am not sure that Shalem spoke those words to me, or if it was a dream to comfort me. The rest I know to be true. First, there was the sound of a woman screaming. Something terrible must have happened to that poor soul, I thought, trying to turn away from the keening, shrieking, shrilling cry. Too dreadful for the real world, the noise of a nightmare. The wild, terrified scream came from a great distance, but its distress was so insistent and disturbing I could not push it aside, and sought to awaken from my heavy sleep and escape the cries. They grew more and more frightening until I realized that my eyes were open, and that the tormented soul I pitied was not dreamed or even distant. The screams were my own screams. The unearthly sound was coming from my twisted mouth. I was covered in blood. My arms were coated with the thick, warm blood that ran from Shalem's throat and coursed like a river down the bed and onto the floor. His blood coated my cheeks and stung my eyes and salted my lips. His blood soaked through the blankets and burned my breast, streamed down my legs, coated my toes. I was drowning in my lover's blood. I was screaming loud enough to summon the dead, and no one seemed to hear. No guard burst through the door, no servants rushed in. It seemed that I was the last person alive in the world. I heard no footsteps, and I had no warning before strong arms seized me, prying me loose from my beloved. They carried me off the bed, trailing blood, screaming into the blackness of the night. It was Simon who lifted me, and Levi who stopped up my mouth, and the two of them trussed me hand and foot like a sacrificial goat, loaded me on the back of a donkey, and packed me off to my father's tent before I could alarm any poor soul still left alive in the doomed city. My brother's knives worked until the dawn, revealing the abomination wrought by the sons of Jacob. They murdered every man they found alive, but I knew nothing of that. I knew only that I wanted to die. Nothing but death could stop my horror. Nothing but death could give me peace from the vision of Shalem slashed, bleeding, dead in his startled sleep. Had someone not loosened the gag when I vomited, I would have had my wish. All the way back up the hillside to the tents of Jacob, I screamed in silence. "Oh gods, oh heaven, oh mother, why do I still live?" I was the first they knew of it. My own mother saw me and shrieked at the sight of my bloodied body. She fell to the ground, keening over her murdered child, and the tents emptied to learn. the cause of Leah's grief. But Bila unbound me and helped me to stand while Leah stared, first horrified, then relieved, and finally thunderstruck. She reached out her hand toward me, but my face stopped her. I turned, intending to walk back to Shechem, but my mother lifted me off my feet, and I was too weak to resist. They stripped off my blankets and robes, black and stiff with the blood of Shalem. They washed me and anointed me with oil and brushed my hair. They put food to my lips, but I would not eat. They laid me down on a blanket, but I did not sleep. For the rest of that day, no one dared speak to me, and I had nothing to say. When night fell again, I listened to my brothers return and heard the sound of their booty. Weeping women, wailing children, bleeding animals, carts creaking under the weight of stolen goods. Simon and Levi shouted hoarse orders. Jacob's voice was nowhere to be heard. I should have been defeated by grief. I should have been exhausted past seeing. But hatred had stiffened my spine. The journey up the mountain bound like a sacrifice had jolted me into a rage that fed upon itself as I lay on the blanket, rigid and alert. The sound of my brother's voices lifted me off my bed, and I walked out to face them. Fire shot through my eyes. I might have burned them all to cinders with a word, a breath, a glance. Jacob, I cried with the voice of a wounded animal. Jacob, I howled, summoning him by name, as though I were the father and he were a wayward child. Jacob emerged from his tent trembling. Later he claimed that he had no knowledge of what had been done in his name. He blamed Simon and Levi and turned his back on them, but I saw full understanding in his clouded eyes as he stood before me. I saw his guilt before he had time to deny it. Jacob, your sons have done murder, I said in a voice I did not recognize as my own. You have lied and connived, and your sons have murdered righteous men, striking them down in weakness of your own invention. You have despoiled the bodies of the dead and plundered their burying places so that their shadows will haunt you forever. You and your sons have raised up a generation of widows and orphans who will never forgive you. Jacob, I said in a voice that echoed like thunder. Jacob, I hissed in the voice of the serpent who shed life and still lives. Jacob, I howled, and the moon vanished. Jacob shall never know peace again. He will lose what he treasures, and repudiated those he should embrace. He will never again find rest, and his prayers will never find the favor of his father's God. Jacob knows my words are true. Look at me, for I wear the blood of the righteous men of Shechem. Their blood stains your hands and your head, and you will never be clean again. You are unclean and you are cursed, I said, spitting into the face of the man who had been my father. Then I turned my back upon him, and he was dead to me. I cursed them all. With the smell of my husband's blood still in my nostrils, I named them each and called forth the power of every god and every goddess, every demon and every torment to destroy and devour them, the sons of my mother Leah, and the son of my mother Rachel, and the sons of my mother Zilpah, and the son of my mother Bila. The blood of Shalem was embedded beneath my fingernails, and there was no pity in my heart for any of them. The sons of Jacob were vipers. I said to my cowering brothers, they are putrid as the worms that feed on carrion. The sons of Jacob will each suffer in his turn, and turn the suffering upon their father. The silence was absolute and solid as a wall when I turned away from them, barefoot, wearing nothing but a shift. I walked away from my brothers and my father and everything that had been home. I walked away from love as well, never again to see my reflection in my mother's eyes, but I could not live among them. I walked into a moonless night, bloodying my feet and battering my knees on a path to the valley, but never stopped until I arrived at the gates of Shechem. I kept a vision before me. I would bury my husband and be buried with him. I would find his body and wrap him in linen, take the knife that had stolen his life and open my wrists with it so we could sleep together in the dust. We would pass eternity in quiet, sad, gray world of dead, eating dust, looking through eyes made of dust upon the false world of men. I had no other thoughts. I was alone and empty. I was a grave looking to be filled with the peace of death. I walked until I found myself before the great gate of Shechem and on my knees, unable to move. If Reuben had found me and carried me back, my life would have ended. I might have walked and wept for many years more, half mad, finishing my days in the doorway of a lesser brother's third wife, but my life would have been finished. If Reuben had found me, Simon and Levi would surely have killed my baby, leaving it out in the night for the jackals to tear apart. They might have sold me into slavery along with Joseph, ripping my tongue out first, to stop me from cursing their eyes, skin, bones, and scrotums. I would never be appeased by their pain and suffering, no matter how ghastly. Nor would I have been mollified when Jacob cowered and took a new name, Israel, so that the people would not remember him as the butcher of Shechem. He fled from the name Jacob, which became another word for liar, so that you serve the God of Jacob was one of the worst insults one man could hurl at another in that land of many generations. Had I been there to see it, I might have smiled when this gift with animal deserted him and even his dogs ran from his side. He deserved no less than the agony of learning that Joseph had been torn by wild beasts. Had Reuben found me at the gates of Shechem, I would have been there to give Rachel the burial she deserved. Rachel died on the highway where Jacob had gone to flee the wrath of the valley, which set out to avenge the destruction of Hamor and the peace of Shechem. Rachel perished in agony, giving birth to Jacob's last son, son of woe. She named the little boy who caused her a river of black blood, but the name Rachel chose for her son was too much of an accusation, so Jacob defied the wishes of his dying wife and pretended that Ben-Oni was Benjamin. Jacob's fear chased him away from Rachel's poor, drained body, which he buried hastily and without ceremony at the side of the road, with nothing but a few pebbles to remember the great love of his life. Perhaps I would have stayed there at Rachel's grave with Ina, who planted herself in that spot and gathered beautiful stones to make an altar to the memory of her only daughter. Ina taught the women of the valley to speak the name of Rachel and tie red cords around their pillar, promising that in return their wombs would bear only living fruit, and ensuring that my aunt's name would always live in the mouths of women. If Reuben had found me, I would have watched my curse wrap itself around his neck, unleashing a lifetime of unspent passion and unspoken declarations of love for Bela and of hers for him. When that dam broke, they went breathlessly into each other's arms, embracing in the fields under the stars and even inside Bela's own tent. They were the truest lovers, the very image of the queen of the sea and her lord brother, made for each other yet doomed for it. When Jacob came upon them, he disinherited the most deserving of his sons and sent him to a distant pasture where he could not protect Joseph. Jacob struck Bela across the face, breaking her teeth. After that, she began to disappear. The sweet one, the little mother, became smaller and thinner, more silent, more watchful. She did not cook anymore, but only spun, and her string was finer than any woman who ever spun, as fine as a spider's web. Then one day she was gone. Her clothes lay upon her blanket, and her few rings were found where her hands might have lain. No footprints led into the distance. She vanished, and Jacob never spoke her name again. Zilpah died of fever the night that Jacob smashed the last of Rachel's household gods under a sacred tree. He had come across the little frog goddess, the one that had unlocked the wombs of generations of women, and he took an axe to the ancient idol. He urinated on the crushed stone, cursing it as the cause of all of his misfortune. Seeing this, Zilpah ripped at her hair and screamed into the sky. She begged for death and spit upon the memory of the mother who left her. She lay on the ground and put handfuls of dirt into her mouth. 3 men were needed to tie her down to keep her from doing herself harm. It was an awful death, and as they prepared her for the grave, her body broke into pieces like a brittle old clay lamp. I am glad I did not see that. I am grateful I was not there, as Leah lost the use of her hands and then her arms, nor to see her on the morning she awoke in her own filth, unable to stand. She would have begged me as she begged her unfeeling daughter-in-laws to give her poison, and I would have done it. I would have taken pity and cooked the deadly drink and killed her and buried her. Better that than to die mortified. Had Reuben carried me back to the tents of the men who had turned me into the instrument of Shalem's death, I would have done murder in my own heart every day. I would have tasted bile and bitterness in my dreams. I would have been a blot upon the earth. But the gods had other plans for me. Reuben came too late. The sun shone above the walls of the city when he arrived at the eastern gate, and by then other arms carried me away. Happy sleeping.